Thank you. I will now call the roll of the Transportation Commission. We did receive regrets from the following commission members. Commissioner Gordon is out of town. Commissioner Fern has a conflicting obligation this evening, and Commissioner Demetrio is attending a Board of Education meeting. If you could please say here when your name is called. Commissioner Felt?
Here.
Commissioner Guru Raja?
Here.
Commissioner Hull?
Here.
Commissioner Nahidi?
Here.
Commissioner Preston?
Here.
Commissioner Parsons?
Here.
Commissioner Smith?
Present.
Commissioner Stoltz?
Here.
Commissioner Trudeau?
Here.
Commissioner Dolan?
Here.
Commissioner, Sergeant Bill Clock?
Here.
Commissioner Cooper?
Here.
Commissioner Lazarus?
Here.
Commissioner Liu?
Here.
We have a quorum.
And pretty good attendance as well. So, any additions or changes to the agenda? Then I'll take a motion for approval.
So
Okay. Can you say your last name as you do that, please?
Motion by Commissioner Nahidi.
Okay.
Second by Trudeau.
All right. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? We have an agenda. And so, with our vast public, I offer you 3 minutes for a commentary if you'd like.
Hi, good evening. My name is Clark Transky. I live at 2646 Traver in Ann Arbor. I'm speaking to you tonight about the Ann Arbor Station study. I've been wading through the 1,000 pages. Very interesting. I want to first acknowledge my thanks to the Parks Advisory Commission last night for voting in favor of the resolution supporting the study, the results of the study. Okay. Oh, it's green. Okay. As I was saying, I want to thank the PAC for their endorsement of the study yesterday afternoon. At times when I think about the station, I think of when years ago I worked at the College of Pharmacy, and at the faculty and staff meetings there was Professor Joe Sinsheimer. And he was the one that always asked, what is best for the students? Something you didn't hear a lot. And I think we have to keep in mind with this study, what is best for the passenger? Don't lose sight of that when you talk about economic development and all these kinds of things. Think of what the basic purpose of the station is. Amtrak in recent years has had this policy of letting it up to the localities to take the lead in stations. It used to be they'd own the station. Of course, years ago, the railroads owned the stations. And if you look at Michigan, they're locally owned are, for example, Troy, Dearborn, Kalamazoo, Grand Rapids, Holland, and I think some others. Not sure of exact ownership on those. Some are owned by the cities, some by local transit authority like Grand Rapids and East Lansing. Ridership here has generally been fairly good lately. There was a long set of difficulties leading up to what's going on now. At first, the railroad was sold to Norfolk Southern from Penn Central, and if their freight train could go 25 miles an hour, that was fine for them. They didn't have to put any more money into track maintenance. So as a result, there are slow orders, as they're called, were issued. Trains took longer and longer, had delays, sometimes unexpected. And then the track was bought between Dearborn and Kalamazoo by the state of Michigan. And the Detroit-Chicago route, over $500 million has been spent on track and signal improvements. And these help freight trains as well as passenger trains. That work is now largely completed. And trains that had been annulled or canceled during construction last year, ridership is up 50% this summer over last summer, and up 10% over that. Does that mean my time's up? Sure.
Just wrap up your comments. Thank you, Mr.
Okay.
Chernowski.
A quick thing, people walking to stations. You have to look at where their origin is, and I did that last couple of days. People come from, not from where you expect, downtown, but from the dormitory areas, even North Campus. So you have to look at the total picture there. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Then we move on to the approval of the minutes. Are there any corrections or additions to the minutes? Then I'll take a motion to approve. By someone.
Make a motion.
All right. Seconded.
Second.
Great. All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right. We have minutes. Then we will move into old business, and we brought back the CIP committee report, which there was a great deal of work put into making this a very coherent and clear recommendations, and hopefully you had looked at that in your packet. What I want to say about this is that I thought it was a fascinating and very positive process, that not only were there recommendations here for you to vote on, but the interaction with the staff was, I thought, extremely positive, and I know that on the committee's part, we learned a lot about all the details, the many, many details. And I think that the staff responded already to many of the suggestions and ideas and the conversation that we had. So I wouldn't look at just the final product, but to realize that already things have been changing, and I think for the better since we set up the committee and had the interactions. So as we are stumbling around as a new commission, I really appreciate that the process itself has been very, very good, I think. And hopefully we will continue to have great process. But I really appreciate the staff for the tremendous amount of energy and attention that they paid to this as well. That was really great. So we can talk about the changes, but I also think that we could accept a motion to accept the recommendations as a whole. If you have a problem or concern about any one in particular, we could break it out and vote on that separately. But are you ready to just go ahead and move ahead, or do you want some more discussion? What's the sense here?
I would make a
Chuck.
motion to adopt this, move ahead.
Great, and that's adopting it without the comments as far as what we deliver to City Council. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
All right, Trudeau. What discussion would you like? Yes,
Yeah, just one point, and this is super nitpicky. There are a few grammatical errors in the first one, so maybe we could just correct those really quick. If we could strike shall from after 2018, 2019, because we already have council should direct, so the shall is
Okay.
redundant with what happens. And then the verb, it should be efforts to calm traffic and lower speed consistent, as opposed to lowering speed.
Great.
When you made the sense, but
thank you. We were
sorry,
putting
it's
three.
nitpicky, but yeah.
No, I appreciate nitpicking. We were putting three versions together, and so that's why the tenses may have changed. Will you accept that amendment? Okay.
It's friendly.
Any other discussion or improvements?
So I have a question. So does this go to planning commission, or does this go straight to council in terms of the process? I'm curious. I think some of these things had recommendations.
Some of them are going to planning
Okay.
commission, yes.
Yeah, so just wanted to clarify that.
That's good clarification, yes.
And I also just will chime in and thank the Chair Felt and the commissioners, Nahidi and Parsons, who worked on this. Clearly took a lot of time, and it takes a lot of learning getting your head around all of this, so thank you both. And in addition to thanking staff for all of their comments and patience, there's a lot of back and forth, which was really helpful,
Yeah,
and that you can see it in the work, so thank you.
great. So, ready to vote? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Thank you very much. That was a good piece of work. All right. And the next, that's our old business, except for a report from the Speed Reduction Committee.
Okay, that's me.
Yes.
The Speed Reduction Committee met, I believe, 2 weeks ago. We have a meeting schedule established with Bradley and Chip and myself, meeting next week, no, this week, October 20th, with staff, and we prepared some questions in advance and some materials that we wanted to discuss at the 20th meeting. And we're also meeting twice in November and twice in December, aiming to have recommendations by the new year. We went over an existing speed limits map of Ann Arbor, but that's old, from 2013, and we're not, perhaps it's not updated, but we discussed traffic calming criteria that are in place currently, and we read over recommendations for how they might be adjusted to be more flexible going forward. And we read over the resolution from the summer of 2015, which was to establish speed limits no greater than 25 miles per hour throughout near downtown residential neighborhoods. So that resolution did not go forward because it was not specific enough regarding the mechanism for reducing speed or the exact goals of the resolution. So at that time, it did not move forward. But we reviewed the materials that are existing, and we asked some questions from staff, updates on the traffic calming, any changes that have already taken place, and what design changes are viable besides reducing speed, percentage of vehicles traveling more than 25 miles per hour on residential streets, how the decisions are being made currently about the speed limits. Because, for example, 7th Street qualifies under the official state rule for the number of curb cuts within a certain distance to be 25, but it's not, so must be more going on besides just like the straight state rule. And we were investigating if there's a neighborhood coordinator on staff. So we will find out answers to the questions we had at the last meeting when we meet with staff on the 20th and move forward from there.
Thank you.
And if they would like to add anything, I forgot.
Kayla, could you, for the folks at home, go over when and where this meeting is Friday, since it is a public meeting and open to the public?
There is a Speed Reduction Committee meeting that is scheduled for this Friday, October 20th at 11 o'clock a.m. in the first floor north conference room at City Hall, 301 East Huron Street.
Thank you.
Great. I think one other thing I'd add to that update is that the committee let me know that they would like to function as the three of them, and I accepted that, and that's why we have not brought forth any names for the committee tonight. All right. Then that concludes old business. We move on to new business. And Eli. How many times have you done this presentation now?
I've done it, this will be the third, and I've seen it 3 other times.
Okay.
So I don't need slides. Oh, but maybe you do, and for the folks at home. Good evening. Eli Cooper, the city's transportation program manager, as well as a member of the commission. The item that I'm here to present to you this evening is overview of the Ann Arbor Station environmental review. I want to be clear, because I know there's been a lot of discussion about the work that's in front of us. What we're looking for in this process is environmental clearance for the federal government to be eligible to make an investment on a project at a location that clears the National Environmental Policy Act requirements. So the work that we've been engaged in over the past 3 or 4 years is in direct response to federal regulations. Our work and efforts and processes are all governed by federal rules, and that part of those rules brings me to both this commission and to the community, as we have gotten to a point where we have the Federal Railroad Administration's authorization to release a draft EA for public comment. For those at home, the public comment period runs through November 2nd, and public comments can be submitted to me, ecooper@a2gov.org, in email form, or it can be posted to me, care of City Hall. The agenda for this presentation is going to start with a brief update. I'm going to introduce the elements of the EA. There is a recommendation. It's described as a preferred alternative within the document. Provide the basis for the preferred alternative, as well as some of the mitigation that would come along with that. Outline next steps, and then, as our agenda allows, for questions to follow. So this slide talks about our project activity since September 2016. The reason that we have that date at the top was that was the last round of substantial public engagement on this project. As I said at the outset, the project has been under development for 3 years, and this process, one of the other presenters identified that there have been 16 public meetings about this subject over time. Where we've been more recently is completing an alternatives analysis. So there were a number of alternatives that were considered and designed, and that the FRA, working with us, identified 4 reasonable, feasible alternatives that they recommended we take into and through the EA process, and that's the emphasis of this presentation. As I've already outlined, we're in the 45-day public review process. I know there have been issues about the engagement of the public. The federal regulations require a minimum of 30 days, excuse me, up to 30 days, or we have identified a 45-day public comment period. There has or is no requirement for public meetings as part of the federal regulations for this process, and this is the 5th public meeting that we've convened in the past week, so that we've have done the best we can to reach out to the community and exceed what's required. Once we receive the comments on the EA through November the 2nd, we will review and address those comments in a revised document. We anticipate that the Federal Railroad Administration would review that and issue what they call a finding of no significant impact. That finding would be published as a draft document, then subject to 30-day review, and after that, the FRA itself could sign an environmental clearance letter allowing for the preferred site to become the selected site, and would then be eligible for an actual federal capital investment. Right now, we are grant funded, and that the grant funding is not specific to a site. In the planning and environmental phases, you don't need to have that environmental clearance. The investment of both federal and local dollars are intended to get to the selected location so a capital project can proceed. The draft EA starts out by outlining the phase 1 alternatives analysis, and I'll very quickly say that in phase 1, what we were looking for in the city of Ann Arbor were 1,000-foot segments of tangent or straight track. The reason for that is that trains need a straight track in order to have proper platform loading, and there were 8 such segments identified in the phase 2 alternatives analysis. What happened was we looked at designing specific station layouts at those 8 segments that actually had access. Some were on the north end by the river, or on the east end of town in Gallup Park, and they didn't have access to public roadways, although there was a straight segment of track. We were left with, at that point, I believe it was 4 segments that were considered, and I will discuss 3 of those as part of this presentation. The no-build alternative, and what I'll call your attention to, is on your screen, you'll see the layout of the existing Depot Street and Broadway Street bridges. On the, I guess call it the center towards the left, you'll see an orange rectangle. The reason I'm doing this is that orange represents the footprint of the existing station. As we move forward through the other scenarios, the orange rectangle will always be resembling the location of the station. The blue corridor is the railroad corridor, and in this image, the gray that is on the other side of the blue from the orange rectangle is the existing long-term parking. In the next series, the gray parking lot will turn into a blue rectangle, which represents parking or an intermodal facility. So that should enable me to go through the next set of slides a bit quicker. The federal rules require we look at the no-build, and someone might say, well, that's a good alternative because it doesn't cost us anything. Also, we understand that it's relatively well located next to vacant property and Lower Town. So these are the kind of factors that are described in the report itself. There are disadvantages to a no-build alternative. First and foremost, there are American with Disability Act or accessibility challenges to the current station. Those would not be resolved. The current station is relatively small. When I say relatively small, the waiting room could accommodate 50 or 60 people. On an average train boarding, we're seeing between 90, and the busier trains are pulling 110, 120 people through a station that can only accommodate seating for half of them. Not bad in May and June. It's a bit of an issue in January and February, and those are the kinds of things that brought this station issue to the community's fore even a decade ago. There were alternatives that were considered, made it through the alternatives analysis, but as we began to lay them on the ground, we realized that they couldn't achieve the intended purpose. Most specifically, there's a tangent segment of track adjacent to North Main. What we heard in the alternatives analysis process was that could be a catalyst that could create economic development interest on the North Main corridor. When we laid out the requirements for the Amtrak station, what we found was all the available and even some privately owned developable land would all fit into the footprint, and there would be no lands left for economic development. So for that reason, that site was not considered as we move through the environmental assessment. Similarly, there were 4 different alternatives designed for the Fuller Road site, and 3 of those sites had footprints that extended east or west beyond the existing parking area. And that we as a project team always understood that we as a community value parkland, and that the intent was to keep the footprint as small as possible, and to actually make sure that it was within the east-west alignment of the current parking lot. And for the reason that these alternatives, although conceptualized, would consume recreational lands beyond the existing parking lot, they too were dropped because we still had alternative 3A as one that both respected the curb lines of the parking lot, didn't intrude into recreational lands, and had the same or similar characteristics to these other 3 alternatives. Bringing me to outline the 4 alternatives that are evaluated in great detail in the report. Alternative 2 refers to Depot Street, and it's at the location of the existing station. Although the 3 alternatives would not have included the existing station, but 2A is an elevated station, 2B is a ground-based station. Looked at that because someone said, might be too expensive to put the station up in the air. Let's look at it on the ground. Perhaps that would be cost advantageous. We had heard loud and clear there was an intent of some in the community to reuse the Michigan Central Depot. And then the 3A Fuller site was also carried forward. At this point, I'm going to present quick illustrations that show 2A, the orange rectangle, is immediately over the top of the blue track, and that provides access to platform on either side, meets Amtrak's guidelines for a station of this size, given the ridership that's anticipated. And you can see immediately to the north of the orange rectangle is a large blue, I guess we call that a quadrangle. It's not quite a rectangle. In any event, that would be the parking for private vehicles. In the footprint of where the station currently sits, or south of the orange rectangle, you'll see a intermodal bus transit facility, so that we were able to maintain the separation between private vehicles and transit operations, which is a recommendation, again, of Amtrak's guidelines for a project of this nature. Alternative 2B, and you have to look carefully at this, what you'll notice is the orange rectangle has moved slightly to the north on the figure, and the blue rectangle has moved slightly to the west, and that was, again, to illustrate that we could, in fact, design a ground-based station at this location, and it has slightly different consequences than the elevated station, but that's part of what we'll get into as I describe the impacts of them. Alternative 2C was if we were to reacquire, or maybe I should use the word acquire, because it was originally built as a railroad facility. It was abandoned for rail use, purchased by a restaurateur, and it's been in that capacity for decades now. So the property would need to be acquired, renovated in order to meet the program requirements for a modern train station, and point out that the intermodal or parking facility is on the west of Broadway, and the depot station is on the east of Depot, and that the details of that are presented in the report. There are advantages, and I think it's clear for me to say that it would be considered reasonable to have a project of this type in these locations. Its current location, it has the same economic benefits to Lower Town and immediate DTE lands. Under the images that I've shown you, it could meet, better meet the current and projected need, would be ADA accessible. There are some challenges that when we look at the environmental regulations as to what we're supposed to look at, we're looking at environmental features, we're looking at how the site and the alternatives relate to the built environment. And what we find is that the land would need to be acquired or assembled in order to cover the footprint of a project of this size. That in the acquisition of an existing business in town, the Gandy Dancer operation within Michigan Central Depot, we run the risk of losing that business, its employees, its tax base. There are floodplain and floodway impacts. So when one looks at the areas where the intermodal facility was in the drawing, those are both floodway, meaning that it's where the floodwaters actually are. Depends on what year storm or what percent storm it is, how deep the water is there. And then the floodplain, which is lands that are upland of where the actual floodwater is running, but still flood during certain events. There would be temporary impacts to the border-to-border trail and the Huron River Water Trail that would result from the need to widen the Broadway bridges. The bridges need to be widened, as described in the report in detail, in order to have proper turning lanes to allow traffic to safely access and egress the drives that would enable access to the parking structure. In terms of intermodal access, the University of Michigan does not currently have transit service to this location. ATA has one bus that stops adjacent to the station and two other routes that run on the bridge across the top. The roadway network would require improvements, as I've described. Broadway bridges would need to be widened. Unfortunately, Depot Street, there is no known solution for the issues. The report does outline, in order to address the overburden of traffic on that corridor, double left turn lanes would be needed both on North Main and on Depot Street, and there's not physical space to do that without acquiring existing businesses, homes, and impacting Wheeler Park in order to create the footprint necessary to accommodate that. As a matter of fact, there are no projects under consideration by the city to make any of those improvements. And I'd also point out that Main Street is a MDOT-owned corridor, so not only would we have to persuade ourselves that those costs were worthwhile, but we'd also have to convince the state. There is known contaminated lands on the DTE property, and in terms of cost, in order to address the environmental issues, the environmental cleanup cost, these suite of projects had the highest cost in relative terms. Build Alternative 3, you can see again the orange rectangle is located immediately over the blue rail corridor. The intermodal facility is both virtually centered on the station as well as immediately adjacent to it. And it resides between the Fuller Road Boulevard and the railroad corridor itself. The advantages are all of the lands for that project are currently publicly owned. City of Ann Arbor owns the lands of Fuller Park. Michigan DOT owns the railroad where the station itself would be housed. There are all the lands that are defined as the footprint of that project are not floodplain nor floodway, so we'd call them high and dry. There's no known contamination or hazardous materials. There would be no threat or loss of business because we're not acquiring existing businesses, no historic properties nearby, and with an improved Fuller East Medical intersection that's currently programmed in the city CIP, the Transportation Impact Study indicates that the current roadway network can accommodate not only immediate operations should they occur there, but would serve and well the demands through the year 2035. And that included a substantial background growth factor applied based on Watts modeling. Transit, there are 2 AAATA routes that go immediately by the property, 7 U of M routes, and what the slide says is a future Ann Arbor connector, and I understand that the connector is being reframed because some of the cost came in for continuing the work on the light rail design, but there's still an over demand on that corridor, and the connector partners continue to look at alternatives to meet the demand. Smallest footprint, lowest increase in impervious surface because the project would be built on an existing parking lot for the most part. Given the small footprint and the smaller impervious surface, lower construction cost, ADA accessibility, able to meet the present and future demands. The disadvantages, so in terms of logical sequence, there are advantages and disadvantages. Not here to say that this is absolutely the perfect site. It does have an impact to Fuller Park, and as we heard in public comment, the Parks Advisory Commission, who has a responsibility for overseeing park, took a affirmative action last night to suggest to council, they don't speak for council, but the recommendation to council is that a increase in the density of transit use or parking on that parking lot is not going to interfere with park use in their view. There are some limitations on transit-oriented development because the lands immediately adjacent to the structure proposed are parklands. They would not be available, but that the report does describe the proximity to Lower Town, and that there is a perception and reality that this station is further from the downtown than the Suite 2 alternatives. After looking at the pros and cons of these 5 alternatives, starting with the no build and looking at 4 build alternatives for the reasons that are on the screen, and I'm not going to reread those things that we've talked about earlier, are advantageous to Site 3A. And since there's a recognition within the NEPA process that if there is an impact, which the acknowledgement of using the parking lot in the park is an impact, even though it may be characterized as de minimis, that there would be an ability for us to integrate some park users' needs into the project. So transportation staff has worked with park staff. There's a commitment of 150 spaces to future park users. So yes, at this location, the structure gets a little bigger, but that's in order to meet the needs for recreational users. There's also an acknowledgement that this location is immediately adjacent to, across the street from the border trail, and the opportunity to integrate pedestrian and bicycle systems into the structure. And we have also, as a project team and as a community, pledged to work both with the community and more directly with the Parks Department to assure that if this project is to be designed on this location, that their input will be taken as we design the aesthetics of the facility. So these are all included within the body of the report and would become conditions of a project if one were to be initiated. Talked about the parking, sustainability, use of solar energy, and also low-impact stormwater management are part of it. I already outlined public comment period, methods of comment. I'll leave this up for a minute or two. Again, my email address. This presentation is on the project website, so if anyone's at home can't write it down that fast, don't worry, it's out there, or mail it to me at the mailing address. Next steps is to complete the comment process, to create a response through a revised document. So we've heard of an arithmetic error here or there within the report. Those will be cleaned up, and we appreciate the public for finding those for us. And that once we complete that revised report and the FONSI's issued, preliminary engineering work can continue. We would anticipate that the next round of public meetings would be later this year because we are working under a tight timeline with the federal grant or contract that we have, and we would be hoping to be back through and into the preliminary engineering before the turn of the calendar. Thank you. Any questions?
Sorry if I missed this. I was trying to make sure I understood the map. When is this supposed to unfold? Like, when would it start being built and when would it be finished by?
You didn't miss it because I didn't say it.
Okay.
Somebody asked me that same question, and the best I could surmise is that the PE process would be completed sometime either, I'll call it the first quarter of 2018, at which point we have an ongoing relationship with the FRA, and we're going to work with them to see if they have funding for the next phase or final design. Final design as a phase in the design development process would be 9 months to a year for a project of this scope. And so assume 3-6 months in order to secure federal funding if such exists, another 9 months after that, at which point we would then be working towards a vote. The current direction that we have from council is that a vote of the community be taken at or before the completion of final design before construction. So a year and a half, 2 years from now, we would have to line up with an election in order to get a vote of the people. Once that vote is completed, then we would be looking for construction funding. Again, don't know. The assumptions from the beginning were that this would be, as Amtrak is a national carrier, this is a federally, a program that has federal interest, we would anticipate 80% federal funding. So we would still have a substantial 20% local share that would have to be identified as well. And then a construction for a project of this size, even though it would be phased, we're looking at a substantial parking structure, an elevated station over Amtrak operating rail line, construction season plus. So best case, we're looking at 3 to 4 years before the first boarding could occur at a platform adjacent to this site. That's absolute best case. I'm not here to outline what month or what year those are, but that's the shortest timeline unless some new era stimulus project comes, and we will be what the expression in those days were shovel ready. we will have a set of preliminary engineering drawings and an environmentally cleared site. And so that if, in fact, resources are available, we would be in a position to begin to advance the design in a more logical fashion. We still have to go to a vote of the public.
Yeah.
No one's going to ask me the question. I'm going to go. I can't imagine the types of feedback you've gotten after presenting in multiple places and people probably bothering you on the street or something. I don't know. So I do have some kind of, I don't know, critical questions, and they're not directed at you personally, of course. So thanks for presenting to us. And I kind of want to, I have a lot of questions. I'm not sure exactly where to start, but maybe I'll start with transit, which is kind of how I got in this position in the first place. It keeps getting brought up that transit routes go by the Fuller site. But the railroad itself is a significant distance from where the buses actually go. And I'm wondering, what is the impact to the passengers who, first of all, how would those rail passengers access the bus services? And if they have to get to the street, that seems kind of dangerous to me. Fuller Road, I should say it's a road, not a street. And if the buses have to pull in, doesn't that significantly affect how thousands of people every day go between Central Campus, North Campus, Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti on the various bus services that we have? And I'm noticing kind of an inconsistent way of looking at level of service when we talk about level of service for car traffic and traffic delay. I didn't see a similar metric for delay associated for traffic or transit passengers, which I think could be significant given this configuration.
I appreciate the question, and the first important component is that the operational details would be something that the city as the facilitator of this project would be working both with the staff of the AAATA, the U of M, as well as Amtrak, who has bus service, Greyhound, and other over-the-road coaches that would be coming to call upon this location, as currently happens at the existing Amtrak station. The design of so it's hard when you just see two rectangles to understand, but the first level, immediately adjacent to the rail loading platform, would be the transit operations area. There is a separate bus-only entrance on the central part of the project. As you look at it, there are two drives that connect to the boulevard. And what will happen is that, again, as I described earlier on, that Amtrak recommends that you separate vehicles from buses, and I couldn't agree with you more. The idea is to assure the best possible transit operating environment, and having a dedicated transit area that is immediately adjacent to the platform, totally enclosed, allows for boarding and alighting of bus transit vehicles, not to be, as you described, unsafely across a boulevard, but literally walking across a platform into a building in a sheltered location, so snow, wind will not affect the people that are getting off the trains and onto the buses, or vice versa. Similarly, you may be correct that there may be some U of M runs that only bypass the station. That's an operational detail, but what we have coordinated with the transit operators early on is, if we were to create this facility, how many bus bays would you need in order to be able to properly serve it? And the context, we've heard numbers that range from 3 to 4 for each of the operators, so I believe that there would be buses that would be coming into this facility. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been designing it and calling it an intermodal facility. Similarly, and I think it's important to point out, for many of the buses that serve the hospital campus, there are bus stops on East Medical Center Drive. There will be a bridge that will extend from the level of East Medical Center Drive. Again, if you look at the orange rectangle, you'll see a beige line heading due south to the hospital. That's a walkway. That's going to lead directly from East Medical Center for pedestrian access, as well as for bus pickups and drop-offs that might just be going by on East Medical Center, but not have the route running time to get into the facility. I hope that answers your questions.
Well, it's an answer, but I'm a little concerned that because it's an operational detail, it gets left to a future analysis, whereas level of service for so-called improvements to roadways, which are really just choices of widening roads, are included in the EA, maybe because it's a capital analysis and you can factor it into the capital portion of it. So, I mean, capital expenses are the lion's share of transit agency expenses, and I think it, in some way, should be included in this analysis. Maybe it's not required for the federal process, I guess. Is that the case? And
I guess maybe I'm not communicating clearly that we have collaborated with the transit operators in our community who have expressed their interest in having a weather-protected, immediately adjacent boarding location. No, they haven't said that each one of every bus that goes by and the capital investment cost for transit. So when you say transit level of service, I would like for you to explain what you mean. The transit level of service for a patron getting off a bus under a roof immediately adjacent to an operating railroad that will take them to Chicago is a very high level of service.
okay, so to clarify, the parallel I'm drawing is we have a level of service that's associated with the general traffic impacts associated with this particular construction project, right? So that's not just the level, that's not just the delay faced by a car going in and out of the station site. It's the delay faced by any car going through any given intersection, right? Similarly, you're telling me that someone getting off of a train onto a bus, that passenger is going to have, you know, weather-protected boarding and all that. But if the EA is saying, well, this site is so great, the Fuller site is so great because there's a lot of transit routes that go right by it. But those transit routes then would either have to deviate to go to access the station, aside from maybe the one that goes on East Medical Drive. They'd have to deviate, or the frequency of the heavily used service between the campuses would have to get worse, whatever that is, higher or lower. You'd have fewer buses per hour, or you'd have to add costs to add more service, right? So there's a cost associated with the operational aspect of it, or there's a deterioration of service quality that I can envision if the service doesn't change. And that's left to a future analysis, whereas the traffic impacts associated with
I'm not aware of a future analysis that gets into the details that you're describing. I mean, if you're talking about run cutting in terms of scheduling, Headway isn't controlled by the length of the route. It's a policy decision of how frequently an operator wants to. So I think that it would be best to say that I think we'll agree to accept that there are different viewpoints on how this facility interacts with transit, local, university, and over-the-road transit operations.
Okay, well, I'll leave it there for now and let others have some comments.
So, just a comment, and I think, Eli, some things that might help when you talk about the transit is to differentiate between Amtrak, east-west rail, and potential for commuter rail. And potential for commuter rail changes the way the buses would interact in this facility significantly, if there is a potential for that in the future. So otherwise, it's more with tying in with schedules, and you wouldn't degrade level of service the way you were describing, because there'd be no reason to run every single bus through the intermodal facility. You would only do it when the trains were scheduled to arrive, which is a couple times a day.
So, I mean, if you can add service to accommodate passengers coming by commuter rail or Amtrak, then why is the current transit service by U of M ATA described as a positive feature of Fuller, of the Fuller site? Right, I mean, it sounds like there's going to be changes in service that could be implemented at the depot site as well.
I think it's recording that there is a different.
That would change the level of service significantly, going to depot as opposed to Fuller. So supporting your own point, it would be even worse.
Well, I'm not sure, but
Well, that's a pretty good idea.
So just one thought, I wonder if what, kind of at the core of this is just a philosophy about how we calculate kind of the impact that happens, making sure that we think, and this is not a critique, this is an idea kind of in the mode of wanting to have transit be considered on par with vehicle traffic, thinking about the impact to service, to wait times, et cetera, of transit like we would for someone in a car. And so just making sure we build it in. That's kind of what I'm hearing at the core of some of this, but I know that there's much more nuance. For example, in all of these sites, there's impact to transit. Right? There's impact in terms of possible wait times. The depot station has one stop, is that right, currently?
One.
Yeah,
Correct.
so there would have to be more, right? So all of that, just having it be factored in a holistic way, I think is what I'm hearing, but maybe I'm grossly understating.
well, yeah, I think you're generally correct about my, I guess, question, like the spirit of my question. All I'm saying is there is the existence of current transit service is used as a feature for Fuller and not for, compared to Depot. And the entire transit environment could change whereby there's added service, which the decisions won't happen until much later, apparently. But it may be that we would be adding service at either location anyway. That's above and beyond or
Again, I want to be clear and use information that we've collected in this process. So our project team has interviewed AAATA operations staff about the feasibility of increasing transit service to the Depot Street corridor. And what they said is no. Because of the bottleneck that exists there during large parts of the day and the amount of transit travel time that they currently lose running one bus per day to that location, they see extreme difficulty, if not impossibility, in accessing that location. And so to your point of, are you counting it accurately, the facts that are presented in the EA show the number of routes and the number of riders that are on those corridors, and the fact that there are tens of thousands of transit patrons currently immediately adjacent, maybe not within the building. It is a factual different level of access that is taken advantage of by people within our community, and we report it as such. It's not given heavier weight than vehicle traffic. It's described as it should be in an EA, qualitatively, in the same way level of service ABC is merely a qualitative descriptor of roadway behavior. It doesn't talk about it in a context that this is why this location is being selected, but please understand that we have had detailed discussion with transit operators and that the opportunities to serve one site are not the same as to serve the other.
So I think just, it would be nice to see something more like illustrations of like how bus bays, how transit buses would go through the site or something before we got to a much later phase, like before like we were approving it, like as a city or whatnot. It's just because his point is exactly the point I was trying to make in my email, is like, I'm wondering how does transit access each site and what is feasible, because I mean at Depot Street right now there's only a small amount that's feasible. There's that one bus that runs every half hour during the day and every hour later at night, and then there's the buses on Broadway which you can get to, but it's a little bit of a walk. And it sounds like if they built on Depot, the only improvement they could do is adding bus stops on the Broadway bridge with a slightly lesser walk, maybe down the stairs still, and maybe an elevator. But, and I'm wondering at Fuller how, I see there would be a place to pull in, but would it be, yeah, like where on Fuller would it be? So we might have an idea of what buses would go down there and how much of a deviation it would be. Because there's a lot of buses in that area, but some, like, I'm thinking like U of M's like Northwood route don't go down Medical Center Drive, they go down Fuller. And if they have to get off across the street on the other side of Fuller, that's not going to work very well for those riders. For the Medical Center Drive, I can see it working, but And that would make a difference in transit access on the site.
So I appreciate the question, and I brought up the alternative 2B image, and if you look at the Depot Street, which is running on the center left side, you'll notice where the current station sits south of the corridor, west of the bridges, you'll see what appears to be I guess it's a black or gray area that has berths in it. And those would be where the transit loading and unloading would occur. Again, the intent here is to get it immediately adjacent to the rail platforms.
Yeah.
So the idea of providing as much advantage to transit as we can offer. Now, I did make the comment that Depot Street has some irreconcilable traffic congestion issues, but the question of if you have transit access and you have vehicular access, and the only place that you can put a large enough building in order to accommodate the parking demand is on the north side, that forces the transit operations either to stay on the main line on Broadway, or for us to create the opportunity for transit to get proximity on the south side. And so as a project team, we don't have a blank slate. We're working with the constraints that are provided. And that I agree that the issues of, as both of the commissioners are suggesting, that every bus is not going to be pulling into the facility. That's not the intent. The intent is to have a capacity in order to meet the needs of those who would need to use it.
So we're about 12 minutes over the time allotted, but I think that the discussion can continue. Yeah, Scott.
I've had a really hard time forming an opinion about this because there's a lot of good and bad about all of these locations. I think the thing that bothers me about the preferred location and the thing that's really hard to capture and the kind of structured analysis that's put together is the Depot location feels like could be designed as a place that fits into the urban fabric, and the Fuller location feels like a disconnected node kind of in the middle of nowhere that you can get places, and when you analyze things by well, just how far is it on the map, it looks fine, but it's like walking from Fuller to anywhere is unpleasant. It's not a pleasant place to walk. It's a road, it's not a street. Walking from Depot Street, there's a hill there, so not everybody will do it, but you feel like you're in a place. You feel like you're in Ann Arbor. You arrived in Ann Arbor and you're here and you see what it looks like and you have somewhere to go. And that sense of arrival matters, that sense of place matters. And I think getting at the slide you had with the sort of the downsides of the Fuller place, the things that hinted at this are there's some limits on transit-oriented development. There's really no adjacent urban space of any kind that could be right adjacent to the station, so you'll never get that sense, I don't think, from that location, and especially looking at the renderings of it's just a giant parking structure. It's the perception that it's not close to downtown. Maybe if you measure on a map, the distance is the same, but the nature of the space that you have to move through to get from the station to downtown is very different, and that matters for walkability, and those perceptions are really important. And so it irks me a little to see that those words to try to de-emphasize those negatives, because I think they're significant. That said, the Fuller location may be the best location for a lot of compelling reasons. The floodway, reasons are real. The challenges of moving buses through are tricky. I'm not so sure it's so important to get the buses right up next to the platform, as long as there's a comfortable and easy way to get to the buses that's accessible. And I'm not sure how much of that is driven by Amtrak preference versus what we've just decided to prioritize in the project. That's what bothers me. And I think why I'm having a hard time deciding. But anyway, so I don't have a question, but those are the things I'm really wrestling with more than anything.
So I'm going to react in a broad sense that when we looked at this transit-oriented development aspect, the first thing that the report talks about is that either of these locations are predominantly developed urban locations. and that there is a scant amount of developable land that leans slightly to the favor of the Depot Street alternative. That's what the report says. Having been engaged as a transportation planner across this great country over 30 years, what I can tell you is transportation planners would die to get the densities that are adjacent to the Fuller location. When you look at the density of development that's immediately adjacent, just south of the station itself, that is transit-oriented development. That meets the highest form of TOD that you can find, where you have thousands upon employees that would be walk distance from your platforms. Now, in the public comments that I've received comments from residents in the Lower Town neighborhood along Maiden Lane, and they describe the preference of the Fuller location because it's walkable and convenient to them. I'm just offering you some of the other ways that these things are looked at, because it is qualitative. By definition, an EA is a qualitative review. But we do have the number of employees, the numbers of residents within that walk distance. We measured the amount of available lands within each of the half-mile walk distances. And so I think that you're right to contemplate these things. The issue is, are we looking at it properly? Are we looking at it from a lens that we only look north from one site, but we look all around the other site? Let's look all around both sites. There's a project proposed on Glen just around the corner from this. That's not anything other than transit-oriented development. It would be a hotel next to what could potentially be an intercity passenger rail station. So I think these issues can be seen through different lenses. And I'm not here advocating that this is better, but trying to measure and share with the commission and the public a variety of information that we have that we're required to evaluate as we move forward as a community.
I just want to react to one thing there, in that, like, if we were talking about commuter rail, I'm 100% convinced this is, if we were doing East West commuter rail, this is where it should go. There's no question, because of that density of that job center. But we're talking intercity rail. Most of those passengers on intercity rail are not going to be going to the medical campus. They're maybe going to places in both directions. But yeah, so that, I mean, if that was, if the millage had passed and we knew it was coming, and that was something we were confident was a reality and not something we just hope will happen one day, I think it really would tilt the scales. But it's not tilting it for me totally. Like, I'm not opposed to the Fuller location, but that's what's really bothering me about it in particular.
And I'm being clear to emphasize the existing intercity service. This project includes the potential to accommodate commuter service. And the RTA is the entity that is responsible for carrying that forward. The reality of when we get to yes and when that service is something that it will serve this site, which one we choose. So it's important that we choose carefully.
Go ahead, Bradley was waiting.
Eli, thanks for the presentation. Thanks for all your work. I know it's been a long, 9 years now? Something like that?
Or more.
Or more. My hesitations are a couple, and one is that while I know this hasn't been rushed, this has been going on for 9 years, this is a debate that's divided this community pretty squarely. And so I feel like we're tasked with making a decision as the Transportation Commission right now, which side are we on, which I feel a little uneasy making based on how thick this was, and I did try to get through everything. I think I could just echo some of the things that others have said here, but I wanted to ask you some specific stuff. It seems to me that all of these build-up alternatives were designed around the numbers provided by Amtrak, and that were in a secondary analysis sort of confirmed, 870 car spaces, something like that. At full build-out, we're talking over 1,300 if everything goes in.
Correct.
So one of my reservations here is that we're essentially putting a really large park and ride in the Fuller Park, right, with a little station on top. And there's not much, as Scott would pointed out, that would go around that. You yourself called those numbers perhaps not well-founded at a January 2017 City Council meeting. Could you talk about that and how much the big build-out impacts where these parking spaces could go. For instance, if in 2035 we end up with half of these numbers, how small would that parking lot be, and how could that have affected that choice?
So the first phase will be somewhere around 650 or so spaces, because we need to accommodate half of, or about half of, the projected Amtrak ridership. The parking is needed by the park users, so that's 150 on top of that. There's also, one of the features of the Fuller site is that the short-term, it's called kiss and ride parking, would also need to be provided within the structure, and that's how you get to a larger number, because they're all within the same footprint, as opposed to being spread around along Depot Street and the like. So I think the opportunity is that the numbers that I described as not being well-founded give us the opportunity to say, as a community, that in the event, and we heard this at the public meeting last week, well, there's Uber service now. Maybe parking is obsolete with autonomous vehicles. And the fact is that, yes, but the Parks Department's looking for parking, that the Amtrak's looking for Amtrak parking. And so in today's day and age, even though the numbers are where they are in fact something that our ability to construct in phases provides us some respite. And the Amtrak numbers are based on zip code and service between Chicago, Detroit, and Pontiac. And there's a lot of science and statistics that go into that. And they're not hard numbers. We don't have counts of how many people are going to bring a car on any given day. And we're looking at 10 round trips a day based on assumptions of higher speed. We heard earlier this evening $500 million has been invested in this corridor. I do believe it's going to change. I know we have a current capacity problem, and if the idea is we're going to build enough to meet the current capacity in an increment for a decade or so, let's do that, get started, and then we can add more, because this environmental review process gives us environmental clearance to add more up to the number that's in here. And that's why we're required by federal rules to look at what the long-term 25-year forecast is and bring that forward now, so that there's no buyer's remorse at some later date.
I just have a quick clarification. I thought it was my understanding that the Detroit commuter rail that we voted on was supposed to go closer to the highway by State Street, or it can be routed to this location, or it's supposed to go to this location?
The RTA, when they produced their plan, indicated, because there was some debate in that process, the RTA was clear. They will serve the operating Amtrak or Ann Arbor station. So if the station is at State Street, which it is today, so if they would have received an affirmative vote, and that's our station, that's where they would serve. But if through the community process, a station is located at Fuller, that's where they would start. There's been some discussion about multiple platforms in the community, but that's not been discussed by rail operators. They would oppose that for a variety of rail operations reasons.
And what was the future outlay of money that the city would pay for the plan, the new plan? Not counting the federal grants, and if there's like a millage. Is there any future money that the city has to spend or approve to spend besides the grants and something that would be voted on?
So with regard to the project that I'm describing, what I'm describing is the full build. And so the city's cost for the project that would include the 250 spaces for commuter service is factored in. Any RTA needs that are not part of what I've described in, or are described in the EA documents, would be considered to either be funded by the RTA, a federal project.
No, I wasn't talking about the RTA at all. I just mean the regular train station Fuller plan. Like for the design phase, for example, is there needing to be like another outlaying of city funds for these
When we
phases?
look at numbers beginning at $85 million and up, that's an all-inclusive, that's local share, future local share. So the amounts that council has authorized us to do the preliminary engineering and NEPA work is all that we have in terms of a local commitment. Yes, there will be additional local funds that will be needed to match future federal grants, should we be fortunate enough to get some. The typical historic ratio is 80-20 for these types of projects.
But you expect that to be a millage or the 20%?
That would be something that I would defer to the CFO, the administrator, and council.
Are there any other questions or discussions that we need to do at this point?
You don't mind? I guess maybe I'll ask a more philosophical question for the commissioners. If we were to come up with ideas for what a train station would look like, right? I mean, what criteria would we use to build one or design one? Would it have 1,000 parking spaces that basically, which is all you can see from the main entrance point? Would it be in an auto-centric area like this one is, or like the Fuller proposal would be? Would it not be walkable to the downtown? Would we use metrics like traffic delay and things like that? I just wonder if in the process of going through the federal rules, which it's perfectly rational to see why a municipality would do something like that. But I just wonder if the federal government rules and process maybe not be entirely in line with the values of our city when it comes to the way we want to see our city over the next 50 to 100 years. So the decision that the city is going to make at some point in the near future is going to impact the next 50 to 100 years. And I have a feeling that the commission was brought together to think sort of outside the box about metrics and street design and transit. And I feel like this is using maybe an auto-centric 20th century way of looking at and analyzing the benefits and costs of this type of infrastructure when maybe a different type of analysis should be supplementing this. So these are just thoughts for anyone's comments.
We could take about 2 minutes maybe to go over that, and I recognize.
Yeah, I just was gonna say, I just thought that, yeah, here I think we have two sites that both have their issues. I mean, I see the point about walking, like, yeah, maybe at Depot Street, it might be more walkable, there might be more density there. I mean, obviously there's the hospital, but that's more just an employer as opposed to like housing density. But at the same point, it is uphill, and there is the issue of transit accessibility, in which case Fuller, I mean, whether all the buses pull in or not, it seems like it definitely is going to be more than Depot. I just looking at the geometry of it all, and I see there being multiple competing concerns that have to do, it's like walkability from, at least from some areas. I mean, it would be more walkable from the hospital, and yeah, ideally we would have a train station right in the center of downtown, like where the Blake Transit Center is, but the tracks don't go there, which it's like, yeah, so it seems like there's a little give and take here, and I think I would like to see more about the walkability and that concern. I think that's something that wasn't talked about enough in the analysis, and also like I'd like to see how the transit accesses the station. And I'm not talking about the intercity buses so much as I'm talking about regular transit routes. Like because I look at Depot and I don't see how it would be much different from what we have there today, which is not much of a transit hub at all. It's just one route we send there to say we serve the Amtrak station. It's like, it doesn't even meet the last train. It's like, but yeah, on the other hand, Fuller, it seems like there would be more, but I'm not sure how much more and how much would just be passing by but not like to see the walking and the transit and how it would work in both sites.
Okay, Commissioner Smith?
Just responding to Sean's philosophical question, I think, following up on some of the previous comments, of course, we'd all like to see the tracks come into our downtown, but we don't have that option. It's not there. It's how can we make the best of this situation? I don't know that this is the best. I don't know if Depot's best. I think, if this were an easy choice, it wouldn't have taken 9 years to get here. Everything that we do has considerable trade-offs to it. That's why we're here trying to make difficult decisions. For my part, I'm glad that this is out and getting public comment. And, I think the discussion that I have with constituents when I knock doors is, about the process of this is, the way it is reported is generally just around the price tag and not what it means to our overall transportation network, what it means to kind of the future of the city. And I think that, none of this really matters if we can't find partners to come up with these matches. None of this matters if the vote fails. We're not going to get the stuff. This has already taken us 9 years. In that 9-year period, I'll point out something that Commissioner Gordon continually reminds me of, is Dearborn had the federal government fund, 90% of their station? 100%. 100% of their station. We have putzed around for a decade, and now we're hoping that 80% gets covered. At some point, we have to make a decision as a community and move forward. We cannot be stuck in this paralysis analysis mode. And I think that when we make the decision, we make it with the best information that we have in front of us. We make what we believe to be the best long-term decision for the community, and we move forward. But I feel that there's so many steps before we can even begin considering construction, so many hurdles to get past that, we got to move forward on something and get some kind of closure on this. And so that we either have a direction forward or we devote our energies to something else.
So we can hear from those who haven't spoken yet. And Howard, did you have?
I do. I think the previous speakers have pretty well established that we are limited by geography and geometry of where the tracks are and what the requirement is for the length of siding, so that we can safely load and unload passengers. And I want to speak towards what Commissioner Smith said. We've got to come to a conclusion on where this thing is going to go, because it is the key that unlocks other opportunities. It unlocks potential redevelopment along the riverfront on a property right now that is just a semi-remediated hazardous waste site. We need to be a partner that can come to the table with the university as they look to prepare their health facilities for the next generation. And to continually live in an environment of uncertainty, we'll wind up in the end, if we think this is a suboptimal solution, in the end, we'll either have no solution or something that could even be worse. So my ask really here is we have to move forward with a degree of certainty. We've gotten to a point where we have missed funding opportunities, as Commissioner Smith has said. So we've labored under the feeling that the process has not been transparent because of the federal rules that apply. And now that we have something that has seen the light of day, we have to make a decision to go forward.
Any other brief comments for anybody who hasn't spoken yet? I think we need to conclude this so that we can look at the resolution. And thank you. We budgeted 5 minutes for that. So I'm going to push us a little bit. And if you want to push back, feel free. But you had the resolution in your packets. The conclusion of it is at the very bottom, which I note does not actually specify a location. Kayla's about to put it up. So in order to open it up for discussion, I'll take a motion for that resolution and a second. Okay, by Commissioner Smith and seconded by, okay. So it's open for discussion.
So what I have on screen are the whereas. I guess I have the entire, yeah, I have all of the whereas and the resolved clauses on separate slides. So if there's one portion of the resolution that you want to jump to, if you could just let me know, and I'll navigate to that so it's viewable on screen as well.
So, Scott?
I'll just say, just despite my indecision of inability to form an opinion on where I think the preferred location should be, I support the resolution. As you pointed out, it doesn't say, we are not saying we're all entirely comfortable with the preferred solution, but I think the resolved clauses, all three of them, I fully support. We recognize, the need for an improved intermodal station. I hope we all agree on that. And the integration of the system, and with that, we want council to move this forward. I think we all do want to see those things happen, and so I'm comfortable supporting the resolution, despite my previously stated concerns.
Any other discussion on the resolution? Well, if there's no other discussion, then we can go ahead and vote.
Maybe I'll do a little discussion.
Yeah.
I feel like we're put in a difficult situation right now, as though we're choosing to support Fuller over expanded depot. I don't know how comfortable I feel voting yes on this at the moment. And I've spent the last 5 days reading as much as I can about this train station and the amount of conflict that it has resulted in this community. So I don't feel like I want to put my thumb on the scales of this fight, if that makes sense. I totally understand the need to move forward, to make a decision. There has been lots of calls in the community for possibly investigating compromise. And I don't know. I just wanted to put that out there.
Any other discussion? Yeah.
I just want to comment on that a little bit. It's okay if there's division among the community about a specific issue like this. I mean, it's fine. I haven't taken any of these disagreements personally or anything. I mean, it's okay. At least we're not, divided, on values, on, treating each other fairly and stuff. And so that doesn't worry me so much. I do worry about the long-term trajectory of our infrastructure. I mentioned, a bunch of points that I think should have been included in the analysis that aren't. Maybe they won't be because they're not in strict compliance with the federal process. So I think in this resolution, it's kind of an implicit acceptance of Fuller as the preferred alternative, and I'm just not happy with that. I have been public with people in my blog and other places, just talking to people about the street about how Fuller is not a bad idea. As Scott mentioned, I mean, if for commuter rail, there are a lot of passengers who would use it. But there just aren't that many intercity passengers who would use it. But I would imagine that commuter rail could be used by both people going to the campus, to the medical center and the Carytown downtown area. So there's precedent for having 2 stations in other cities for commuter rail. I'm not suggesting that for intercity rail. So I know it's not been looked at, and I'm not sure exactly why. I know Eli mentioned that the rail operators didn't want to deal with it. I assume that you're talking about Amtrak, right? Because there is no rail operator for commuter rail yet.
So through the planning process related to the RTA and SEMCOG prior to that, there have been rail experts that have been brought in from Chicago and other places, working with commuter systems and working with railroad systems. And the cost for the proper switches and sidings and positive train control that relate to a station, and having, at one point, we actually, within the city, looked at creating a commuter platform only at the Fuller site. And I recall the cost ran into the millions of dollars. And so the issue is both operating multiple platforms and the construction of them and the maintenance cost, the delay that would occur on railroad timetables for stops that would be within physically a half a mile of one another is something that is just frowned upon within the industry. If you're in downtown Chicago and you're running Metro, that's a proper distance for station stops. But with regard to a community the size of Ann Arbor, with the employment base, that 2 station stops within a half a mile would be virtually unprecedented.
So I'm going to focus us back on the resolution rather than opening up that debate again.
Okay.
So is that still relevant, Howard, or?
No, I'm good with that.
Okay.
Appreciate you doing that.
Okay. I just have one comment, which I've been very undecided about this. And at this point, I'm going to support the resolution, partly because there will be a vote of the public later on. That is of critical importance. And I think that the whole process has been opened up suddenly after being required by the feds to be so secretive, which was really unfortunate. And I also trust that we will be able to have future input as this goes along and through the design phase and different things. And so with those caveats, I'm going to go ahead and support it. But I came into this meeting not knowing which way I was going to go. Anyone else, especially those who haven't spoken, want to make any comments?
Yeah, well, I think this resolution is really just a general, we support the process and we want to advance the idea of a new train station. It doesn't say we support alternative 3A, which is the preferred alternative. That's not what I see here. I can see people saying maybe, oh, this is a proxy for that, but I don't see it in the resolution. Now, I'm wondering, though, I mean, is there more we want to say? Like, because this seems rather generic as far as, I mean, I don't know, I don't think we want to say we support Fuller or we support Depot or anything like that at this point. There's too much division on that, but I'm just wondering, like, what is this resolution going to actually accomplish? Because it seems rather innocuous, I mean, looking at what it is, but at the same point, I'm wondering what it's going to accomplish.
Well, it's what's needed at this phase of the development of the environmental action statement.
So we're just saying, like, this process seems okay. I mean, we like the idea of the train station and.
Well, it specifies a little bit more, but yeah.
Yeah.
Any other comments before we vote? Can we just clarify that? I mean, does it specifically say we support option 3A?
No.
No, okay.
Right, Eli? It does not.
I have no problem letting the process go through that.
Okay.
For myself. Speaking for myself.
All right, then I'll call for the vote, which is all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
Aye. One.
Okay. And any abstentions? Thank you very much. I think we all learned quite a bit. Great. And then I believe the next item up on the agenda is Howard talking to us about the City Council request regarding crosswalks.
Thank you. The item before the commission is the result of a resolution that council took at its September 18th meeting. At that time and prior to it, several of the council members have received concerns from members of the community about the form of our crosswalk ordinance, specifically in that it is different than the state's requirement. Primarily, the difference is that we require drivers to stop for pedestrians about to enter a crosswalk, as opposed to having to yield for pedestrians who are in the crosswalk. The debate has centered in part around whether or not that creates a false sense of security for pedestrians and whether it unsafely emboldens pedestrians to enter into crosswalks. In all good conscience and faith, council then asked us to take a look at that, and I thought it was an exceptional thing to bring before Transportation Commission. So in addition to the material you've been provided in this evening's opening of the discussion, this will come back at your meeting next month as well. Council set a date of December 18th to bring it back with the Commission's recommendation. And particularly what we have been charged to do as staff is to provide an engineering review of the city code, provide an applicable definition of a crosswalk. There's a request to summarize the infrastructure that's been added since the adoption of the 2010 ordinance. And then recently there have been some removal of curb ramps, and council asked us to provide a justification for that. Again, the actions that we've been directed to take are to present these items to you for review and policy recommendations, and then take your recommendations to the City Council's Policy Agenda Committee meeting. After having done those things, the results will be presented to the full City Council on or before the December 18th meeting. So that's the item that has been opened for Commission's discussion and consideration.
And I can just add a little, to what Howard has presented as far as process for the commission. So with your agenda materials for this month, you received the information that's been compiled, reviewing and summarizing the infrastructure added since the adoption of the 2010 ordinance. So that was the list of RRFB, rectangular rapid flashing beacons, the gateway treatments, the pedestrian islands, and that was with your agenda materials hyperlinked as a PDF. So we're providing information to you as it's compiled towards this resolution, so you get it knowing that there's a deadline of December 18th, trying to make this available to you as soon as possible. As more information becomes available, we'll pass that along to the commission with the goal that all of this gets to you before your November meeting. And so the process will be that we'll ask commission members to submit recommendations to the chair, Linda Diane, and to me, your staff liaison, in advance of the November meeting. At the November meeting, we will go through those individual recommendations that were submitted by each commission member that chooses to submit any recommendations. We'll talk through those together as a commission, and you'll take action at that meeting. Your December meeting isn't until December 20th, so we won't be able to wait until then to consider action on whether or not, what recommendations you're forming together as a commission. So please just watch for that information that will be coming to you, and be prepared if you'd like to make any recommendations around this, to submit those to us. You can bring other recommendations for discussion at the November meeting, but as much as possible to submit them in advance will help.
Yes.
I was wondering, in order to properly assess the situation, it seems important to have information about enforcement and education, not just the infrastructure. And so I wonder if we can be provided with materials about any education the public has received about the ordinance and what they're supposed to do, to what degree the education is ongoing, and what enforcement procedures. We have information about the Florida driver behavior study, but besides that, what has been since that time our strategy, and what would our strategy be going forward?
Those are certainly reasonable requests. Kayla's taking it down, and we can provide that.
And if you think of anything else like that, you can make requests after this meeting too. Bradley?
So I just want to clarify, Kayla, sorry. So we're going to be acting on this and talking about it more at the November meeting, which means we'll be getting things throughout this month that we should review and send suggestions and feedback ahead of time.
Yes.
Is that in a nutshell?
We will make information available to you as soon as it's compiled and ready to be distributed. So if there are information pieces that come in, Howard reviewed the information that's being compiled. That's rough. That's 1, 2, 3, the first 4 bullet points in the resolution that was with your agenda. As that information is compiled, yes, we'll make it available. What you should be submitting to us are your proposed recommendations.
Okay.
Because the commission is asked to propose recommendations. So as commissioners, we're looking to each of you, what recommendations would you like to propose?
Okay.
Submit those.
Cool, thank you.
Okay? Please, as much as possible, put those into our hands ahead of time. That would really help the process. All right, enough on that item? Then I'm up next to talk about the Pedestrian Safety and Access Task Force. And we budgeted 10 minutes for this, and then we're going to get some information about the status of the recommendations. And the PowerPoint that I put together is extremely brief. It was over an hour-long PowerPoint that we presented to City Council initially, and I chopped it and left out all the good cartoons, too, so I'm sorry. And I don't have access anymore on my screen, but I can move over here.
Control the presentation.
Okay,
Should, I think the signal will work.
right. So I hope that you're,
You switch?
that's okay. This is blank. I hope that you're fairly familiar with the task force. It was a really great opportunity to work with some outstanding people. And Kayla was one of our staff support people as well. So we were appointed in 2013 and ended up making our presentations to them in 2015. And then since then, a number of them have actually been implemented. I wanted to just say a bit about the community engagement, because that was not mentioned as much in the report. It was there, but not highlighted. We did a lot of engagement with the community. We had a lot of people coming to our meetings, and significant turnout for the community meetings as well. And I certainly changed my mind on a few issues just from the community feedback and support. That was really impressive. So the cartoon reads, I was distracted for a moment. Go on, as he drags a steering wheel. We identified 5 issues to address, and basically devised the recommendations from that. And so they are very pedestrian focused, because that was the focus of the task force, was about pedestrian safety. And from the conglomeration of information that we got from the public, we ended up with 7 behaviors that they were most concerned about. And here we have a woman kicking a van and says, "In this city, Jack, you learn to respect the pedestrian." So we have motorists passing vehicles that are stopped for pedestrians in the crosswalk, motorists failing to stop for pedestrians, especially at mid-block crosswalks, motorists failing to stop for pedestrians at school crosswalks. There's a trend here. Motorists failing to yield to pedestrians when turning at intersections, inconsistent signing, as well as other signaling. The Pedestrian Safety Task Force ended up being very concerned about snow and ice removal. And we made a very strong and dramatic presentation to the City Council early on. We moved this to the very top consideration and pressed for a very conservative, some say radical, focus on snow and ice. And that was modified and made a little bit easier. During the process, there was a lot of response and anger about our recommendations for immediate removal and complete removal. So we got someplace, but we felt like that wasn't as complete as we'd liked it to be. But there has been significant improvement, particularly with the A2 Fix-It process of reporting snow and ice. So I'll just mention that that was very, very important to the task force. And then, of course, we have motorists speeding in residential neighborhoods. We did adopt the Vision Zero concept, and the goal was to have 0 traffic fatalities. And so we came up with these specific objectives, and under each one, there are between 5 and 10 at least recommendations. So we have 70 or 80 recommendations altogether, and we prioritize those. And I really would refer you to the report to look at each one. And there's links to that report in case you didn't use it yet. And I can talk about those, but I'd rather sort of respond to questions rather than go over them, because it's all there in the paper. There's more information about Vision Zero. And as the staff has pointed out, Ann Arbor has not adopted a particular definition of Vision Zero yet. And so that is something that I'm interested in sort of working into the Transportation Commission's work, is to helping the city come up with a more specific idea. As far as the implementation strategies, certainly that was one of our ideas, was that pedestrians would begin to have more clout, and certainly that climate has changed dramatically in the last few years even, or even in the last few months, I think. It gets stronger and stronger. That's pretty much what I wanted to present, because if you don't give me an hour, there's not a whole lot more I can say. But if you had questions or specifics that you wanted to point out, I'd be happy to address them. And then we're going to talk about what has been implemented. So it's a great report. And I didn't mention that Norman Cox of the and Carolyn
Prudhomme?
Yeah, of the Greenway Collaborative were incredible facilitators and experts who worked with us in the process. Any questions or comments? Okay, then we can go into, so what happened next? Where are we?
Thank you, Linda, Dan. So yes, I'm here to provide an overview update on where we're at with the recommendations, and with knowing how much time we would have, or how little time to this. This will be high level, so I just give that advance, and certainly if the commission wants more detail at a future meeting, we can certainly come back with more specifics, but do have some things we certainly want to pass along. So first, to give the big picture, literally, of those recommendations that the task force brought forward. The report included 61 total recommendations that the task force developed under 5 areas. And the task force provided a great point of departure in prioritizing those. And so, as you can see on the slide here, about half of them were given a priority compared to the other half. So 31 of the 61 were priority recommendations that needed more immediate focus. And so the bottom of the graph is a breakdown of where we are on the status of those. So 4 of them have actually been completed. 20 of them are in progress, and some of those are even ongoing. So things they might not, some of these, till we get into the detail to really explain, some are short-term, completing something, but some may be longer term or even programmatic. 4 of them have not started yet, and I can get a little bit of detail on that if time allows, but 3 are still to be determined, and to get into that a bit, but in part is some lead work into really what needs to go into it, and even the matter of kind of ownership, if you will, of that, those items. So with that, that leads me into the broad scale of the recommendations, that these recommendations don't fall on only the police or half on police and half on engineers, that they really are very broad in how they cascade and touch people within the organization. The groups listed here, systems planning, where Kayla and Eli are from, engineering. Public Works is our maintenance arm, some even to the administration of public services, so my boss. The Planning and Development Group, Parks and Recreation, as we see here, communications with our safety program. Community Standards, actually, for some clarification, is the key group, as Linda Diane described, snow and ice. That's our enforcement arm, so if there's issues needing to be enforced and perhaps ticketing or warning, that's their role. As well as the police department for enforcement of traffic and pedestrian bicycle-related items, and an item actually in for the Downtown Development Authority in terms of walkability and the parking system. And there are actually a couple of items that truly fall within the realm of City Council and actually now the Transportation Commission, now that we have a Transportation Commission. So really, with a couple minutes left, wanted to really just kind of tee up and, in essence, introduce for you as the commission what those items were that, as staff, we see really fall within the realm and the purview of the commission from the recommendations there. And again, these were 4 of the priority recommendations. So the first one, make transportation system accessible to all. Quite frankly, from our perspective as staff, that is the Transportation Commission. That's your role is to move us forward as staff, as an organization, as a community, and challenge us to do that. So in essence, that's one you're doing, you're going to continue to do, and quite frankly, one of those that will be an ongoing, always in progress item. So we took credit that that one's already started and in progress. But that one's within your purview. Another specific one was looking at putting in place an ordinance that bans handheld and also hands-free devices. And what's up on the slide is the actual quoted recommendation from the task force report. So first, just explanation as to, well, why does that fall on the commission? Don't you have attorneys? I mean, an ordinance. But really, in terms of guidance and direction for things related to the transportation system, it would be the commission lending guidance to staff. Yes, it would be staff and the attorneys and the appropriate technical staff that would generate and develop those ordinances. But we need that guidance first from the commission as to what is it that you're looking to develop, then coming back through the commission, making sure have we hit everything that we're looking for, but then ultimately it's City Council as that approval body and authority. We don't want to go off creating something that isn't meeting what the commission needs, but yet the commission's not going to do it on your own. But that initial guidance there is on the commission. So that's how we've identified that. Now, one thing on this, though, that its status is listed there is not yet started. Key piece of that being, well, we didn't have a commission yet pushing us and kind of guiding us and telling us we need to do this. We have done at least initial inquiry, if you will, through our attorney's office of the landscape, if you will, of state law as it currently is, where things are with legislation on handheld devices. And from my notes, the state has enacted state law MCL 257.602B. Sorry to throw all the jargon at you, but basically there is legislation on the books that prohibits the use of handheld devices, communication devices, while you're operating a motor vehicle. And so that hits at a part of this already, the hands held. So then be left with, well, what about the hands free? Well, another key piece of that legislation states that this state act supersedes any local ordinance. So in essence, it's saying we're going to trump anything local. Doesn't say we still couldn't put something into place, but does bring in the legal question. Is it going to have any effect? That sort of thing. The other piece, if you read the recommendation, also speaks to a prohibition on handheld, hands-free devices also for cyclists and the use of bicycles. That is actually already in place at the state level. And it's written broadly, not specific to handheld devices, but the state act, if anyone's interested. That one is MCL 257.661. That's quite short. I actually have it here if anyone's interested. It's basically one paragraph, but basically it says, anybody operating a bicycle, motorcycle, moped, you can't be carrying any package, bundle, or article that prevents the driver from keeping both hands upon the handlebars. So pretty simple, but the advantage of broad, it touches this as well as other things that you can't have two hands on the handlebars, you're in violation of that already. So that's why there hasn't been anything started on that one as yet, and also with the commission and your role there. So if you choose to have us look at that, that certainly could be done, but that's where that stands. And then actually the last two that fall under the commission as seen by staff, really you folks have started, and they both relate to speed reduction. And you folks, as Commissioner Preston reported, committee's already been formed, starting to work. And so I'm not sure yet if we've officially truly given the wording of the two recommendations officially to the committee, but if we haven't, you certainly will by now, that there were two specific recommendations from the task force in terms of encouraging traffic management to 30 miles per hour or less on the major arterial and collector roadways, and as well as 25 miles per hour or less on the local streets. And so that work is, you folks have already jumped ahead of me even coming to you, pointing out that I was here, and so job well done to get that started. And so with that, that's where we're at on the priority recommendations. And as I said, if there's more detail, certainly a topic for a later meeting to get into more detail on all of them, we can certainly do that as well.
Thank you. Any brief questions or comments? All right then. We'll move ahead on the agenda, which is staff reports and updates.
So I could just stay right up here as
Sure.
I have. And as usual, Kayla's included in your packet the update report. And as is becoming my approach, just trying to go through and highlight some of the major items, and particularly the changes from the last month's report. Under construction projects, things are winding down with our street resurfacing project, still going through October, and the more major streets where we're currently wrapping up, South University, Forest, Liberty, and Miller. Under the school safety improvements section on the first page of the report, just want to point out at the bottom, we've referred to some added information that is actually at the back of the report. We've titled it Appendix A, which is school safety improvements, some specific. This actually came from a report that was provided to Administrator Lazarus to council that staff had put together, and we're working off of that list and providing the update information. So that's a little more detail than what's been provided a bit with the update, as well as the report itself. I touched on this a bit at the last meeting, that Nixon Green Duvarin intersection, that intersection had been open to traffic by the time of our last meeting, but now even the related work around it is substantially complete. So that one is pretty much fully wrapped up. And the Plymouth Green intersection, which at its heart was actually a water main project, but definitely had its impact on the transportation system there, is continuing. The intersection is back open up, and we're doing the last bit of water main work down Green Road west of, down Plymouth Road west of Green. And that work is scheduled to be completed in November. So then hopefully things will be back to normal before the winter season. I'd like to highlight under projects currently in design and planning, the Pauline Boulevard project. It's been of interest of the commission as well as the CIP committee. Wanted to just highlight and report there was a public meeting held last Thursday at Slauson, and residents and members of the community came to that, and I thought that was a very beneficial opportunity. Commissioner Parsons and Smith were there, as well as members of the community and residents, and a lot of good discussion and feedback, which was taken back to the project team earlier this week for them to factor in as their design continues on the road portion of that project, which again is another water main project that is resulting in opportunities to alter the road surface as much as we can there, so. And I think the last one's just to mention the Allen Creek berm opening, one that the commission actually was introduced to very early on. I think it was even the first meeting, maybe even the second meeting. That work is continuing at 60% point of the design plans. Again, as a reminder, and mostly for folks at home, this is a project that it originated as a stormwater flood relief project down at Depot and North Main Street to, as we were talking, rail stations, to actually open up an opening through the railroad berm to relieve floodwaters there, but also pairing with that an active transportation project to also put a parallel tunnel adjacent next to that flood relief opening. And so that project is moving forward. And I just wanted to highlight in this update, it was noted that a meeting recently, coordination meeting hosted by MDOT, who is involved with funding, but also, as has been mentioned tonight, the owner of the railroad, which the opening is going to be constructed. And the meeting included representatives from MDOT, SEMCOG, FEMA, and the city staff. So a lot of coordination, a lot of people interested and involved. A complex project, but one that's going to make a tremendous impact. So that continues to move forward. And so with that, if there's questions, otherwise that's my highlights.
Thank you very much. All right, are there any liaison reports from those people representing organizations? Yes.
Can I give an update on the A2 Safe Transport Group? The concerns that have occurred in the past since our last meeting?
Can you give it?
Yes.
Sure. Like 1 or 2 minutes?
Yeah. We just had 3 issues in the past month that were salient that I wanted to bring up. Another student at Huron High School was hit by a car on her bicycle crossing Huron Parkway. And it was similar to the issue in the task force report where a school bus stopped for the person, but then the car in the other lane didn't stop. So when she emerged from behind the school bus, she was hit by the car. And she did not activate the RRFB when she crossed. So, but also the bus was blocking the view. But I think it highlights 2 ongoing problems that haven't been resolved by putting in the RFBs, which is education to the community and the children about why they need to activate it and why, even if it's activated, you have to like watch as you go. It's not clear to me that they're getting proper education on how to use these and why it's important. And the swerve around is, I mean, the report was almost 5 years ago. It's a considerable problem and a limitation to the success of any RRFB or crosswalks. And there was also a question about at Community High School whether gateway treatments would be there over the winter. So they had installed some in a confusing location before, and they were going to put in a new crosswalk before the winter. But it sounded like there would not be any gateway treatments during the winter. So there's confusion about that. And the last point is we are having problems where there's grassroots efforts to improve pedestrian safety around schools. And the city of Ann Arbor has asked the community, well, we don't have money for all these things, so why don't you go get a grant and then we can put in these improvements if you find a grant. And North Side went through like a multi-year process of applying for a grant from the Safe Routes to School program, and they successfully
had everything worked out. They went through this very detailed process, involved community engagement, research by Michigan State students, multiple reports, and everything was ready to go, and the city failed to submit the paperwork that was necessary from the side of the city in order to receive the grant.
I want to
So-
clarify that because that's not an entirely true statement.
Okay, I'm happy to hear the
Very
true
briefly.
statement.
So that program receives input on a rolling basis. There was feedback, to my understanding, from the state where they were asking for additional detail. The work itself is not scheduled till next fiscal year, so the 1 month delay in getting the paperwork into MDOT is not going to affect the schedule for implementation of the hard infrastructure.
Okay. We have a report and a clarification. Any other?
And
Report.
there was also a grant to put in speed measuring signs at Huron, and we're unclear on if those are ordered, are not ordered, are on the way.
So Mr. Yupi informed me Tuesday morning that they've been ordered and we're going to work to expedite them. There was some give and take with the school district about what was desired. I would admit that we should have pulled the plug on that earlier and just told them it's time to fish or cut bait. So but it's been ordered and we will work to expedite that. There's also a backlog in ordering of RFPs. So that is something that is more at the manufacturer's level than any, staff didn't cause any delay on that. That's a equipment manufacturer issue.
Mr. Lazarus, is that a speed measurement sign like we utilize, or just a lighted speed limit sign?
It is a speed limit sign that sets the speed limit based upon when the school zone hours are effective. It's not one of those active signs that shows how fast
To
you're
make
going.
sure that we're all on the same page, that it's just a speed limit sign that's lit, not a
But it's,
measuring
Although
device.
it's
they
like
do-
a
they-
dynamic one that changes
Correct.
for the school zone times?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the
Yeah, yeah.
clarification.
Although they do manufacture ones that do both.
Any other liaison reports? All right. If any commissioner has a report to make, very briefly,
I have an agenda item, I don't know if I have a.
that's next.
That's next, okay.
Okay, go ahead. We'll move to agenda items.
I have two things from Planning Commission. The first is, and my memory of this from last night is a little vague. We had a very long meeting last night, but I got an email from our planning manager. We are planning to do a working session in the near future for Planning Commission to review traffic impact studies. We get those a lot with large site plans, and traffic is very frequently a concern whenever there's a new development or large redevelopment. And we wanted to know if there was interest from this commission to do a joint working session, so we could all attend that working session to be educated on that process and what that all entails, because it's a pretty involved thing, and we're always a little vague on exactly what's factored in, what's not factored in, and what all the different components mean and that kind of thing. So I don't know whether there's interest in doing a joint session or not, but if there is, we would be happy to work with staff to figure out how to schedule that and accommodate everybody.
Okay, I'm seeing some head nods, enough to say yes.
Sorry. Okay, great. Then I will talk to Kayla and Brett about making that happen. Thanks. And the second issue I wanted to bring up is something for us to consider for our work plan. Bicycle parking comes up a lot with new developments. And in particular, last night during a particular review, a public comment was made about our bicycle parking ordinance and questioning whether appreciating that it exists, but questioning whether it's currently optimal in terms of what we're asking developers to build when they build new developments. And if you're not familiar with the ordinance, which it's complicated, but essentially depending on the type of development and either the number of units or number of square feet, and the zoning, the ordinance dictates how much and what kind of bicycle parking is required. And there are a number of points that have been brought up. There's like Class A, which is secure.
without going into the details.
So without going into the details, adding that to our work plan to review the bicycle parking ordinance and make recommendations for changes to Planning Commission that we might consider.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you.
Sure.
As long as we're on the topic of our work plan over the coming months, I would like this body to look at overall enforcement, speed enforcement, traffic enforcement. Certainly, we will be getting the Hillard Hines study reviewing our police department very shortly. And I think there will be numerous recommendations that come out of that, some of which talk about operationally how we handle enforcement and the quality of that enforcement. I would like this body to provide some feedback and input onto how we do those things.
Okay, another item? Any other agenda items pertinent? All right, then if there are no objections, I will call the meeting adjourned. All right, thank you.